Okay, yeah, does it work? Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aleksandra, and I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London. And the project I'm going to talk about today is on leveraging modern representation learning machinery for an instrumented infrastructure problem. So let's first quickly recap what representation learning is about. So basically, is to build mappings of arbitrary data points to numerical space. These numerical spaces would capture certain properties of the data. One of such properties is similarity, for instance. We might want two data points that are similar to each other in some way to be mapped to the numerical value. Why is this useful? Because this can later be leveraged, for instance, for anomaly detection. You can imagine that if some point falls from the majority of the points in this numerical space, then it might be an anomaly, and it is worth looking into. So in complicated domains with big data, with big volumes of data, this data similarity is hard to explicitly define in terms of models or rules. So we rely on more complicated machine learning methods to capture it for us. So we've been wondering if we can apply some modern representation learning techniques in the engineering domain. So here you can see an example. For instance, we might have an image or like any kind of data that we are working with, and we might try to map it to like a floating point vector or something. Right, so I'm sure there's been enough deep learning hype these days, so I won't dwell on this slide for too much. But basically, the core idea of deep learning is to use really big compositions of simple functions to automatically interpret data. These big compositions are called deep neural networks, and these smaller functions, each of these smaller functions that take part in this composition is called a layer. So here is an example of one neural network. It's not really deep. It's only got two layers between the input and output, and these layers basically, they are linear here, so everything is pretty much connected to everything in this architecture. So the representation learning technique that we are going to use for this project is called an autoencoder. Autoencoders are an unsupervised technique, which means that they don't need any predefined labels to train, in contrast to the supervised learning techniques, for which you typically have to construct a data set of points and corresponding labels before you start training the model. Classic example of a supervised learning technique is classification. So what is an autoencoder? An autoencoder is essentially a composition of two neural nets. You can see the structure here. What does it do? It maps the input data point to some numerical vector called code. This is done by the first neural network, which is called the encoder. And then the second part of the autoencoder, called the decoder, takes the code and tries to reconstruct this code as close to the original input as possible. So as the original inputs can be really high dimensional, complex, and the data can be big, and for the codes we aim for something compact, so they are of much lower dimensionality, then obviously we usually lose some detail in the data. So that's why you can see that the reconstruction here is a bit blurry compared to the original input. Right, so now back to our problem. Our data set consists of sensor measurements that were collected from one steel concrete half-through railway bridge here in the UK. There are 80 sensors in total, and they are positioned in 4 tracks on this bridge. The sensor measurements were taken at the frequency of 250 Hertz, and we've got about 2.5–3 hours of data. So imagine the volume of the data we're dealing with here. Occasionally a train might pass through this bridge, which is picked up by the sensors. So in the first picture here, you can see some of strains of all 80 sensors around the train event occurs. So it's marked in black here. You see that there is some interesting structure train event, and this is clearly different from what was before and after it. So these data originally are unlabeled, which means that we don't know for sure when there is a train on the bridge. But we did construct some labels manually just to evaluate our methods. So the data also are non-homogeneous. There might be drifts, like the one that you can see in the picture, on the second picture over here. And these drifts might occur due to external factors, such as temperature changes during the day, for instance. So the size of the data and this non-stationarity that we observed actually makes the data process. So the question is, can modern representation learning methods based on deep learning help us process such data? Right, so the goals of the project. Our long-term ambition here with this data would be to monitor the response of the bridge to such train events over time and catch any changes to this response, because they can point to the structural degradation of the bridge. This activity is commonly referred to as structural health monitoring, and it was touched upon in the previous talk. And here, in this particular project, as the initial proof of concept, we attempt to use the autoencoder machinery to pick up train events from this data. The events account for a very small portion of the data set, in fact. So there are, I guess, less than 1% of the whole data points are actually points that train events. So this leads us to the anomaly detection problem quite naturally. We use a technique called Variational Auto-Encoder, which is a modification of the classic autoencoder, which I touched on earlier. I won't go into maths for Variational Auto-Encoder here, but the key points is that first, the Variational Auto-Encoder imposes additional constraints on the numerical mapping space. This numerical space is latent space, and it also provides probabilistic assessment for each of the data points rather than just one number, a point estimate. So VAE is known to map similar data close to each other in the latent space. For instance, here you can see a picture of the two-dimensional latent space for the MNIST dataset. MNIST dataset is a dataset of handwritten digits from 0 to 9. So the points in this 2D latent space are colored based on the type of the digit. And you can actually see that each of the digits here builds a little cluster in the latent space, and these clusters can be separated. Right, so what we hope for, we actually hope that our anomalies, our train events, data points, would be mapped away from all other non-event data points in the latent space of our variational autoencoder. And this should be picked up by the second part of the autoencoder, which would give us a number quantifying how likely every single point is to be an anomaly. And if this number is high enough, exceeds a certain threshold, then we will mark it as such. Right, so what did we see in the end? let's have a brief look at the latent space that we observed. So we actually did see that anomalies are indeed separated in the latent space of our VAE. So here you can see this big cluster of no train data points, and you can see that the absolute majority of the points that are further away from this cluster are actually train events. So this is quite nice. But we still did need some formal evaluation of how well our model does compared to something. And we chose to compare it against a commonly used method for anomaly detection, which is called cumulative sum control chart. So basically the QSUM method monitors changes in the mean of some time process over time, and it signals when there are deviations from the expected mean which exceed certain thresholds. So we used, in order to evaluate how well these two models do, we use classic metrics for assessment of the quality of classification. So these are called precision, recall, and F1 measure. Precision essentially tells you, if you say that a certain point is an anomaly, how often you're right and how often you're wrong. Recall shows how many actual anomalies you manage to pick up and how many actual anomalies you manage to miss. And F measure balances precision and recall, because you can imagine a model that for every single point says that this is an anomaly, and for such model, recall would be really high, but precision would be super bad. And on the contrary, you can imagine a very, very conservative model, which would only label a couple of anomalies, and the precision would be really high, but recall would be low. So we need something to balance these two, which is the harmonic mean of these two values, and this is what F measure is basically. So here you can see that our VAE-based anomaly detection model actually outperforms QSUM in all of these three metrics, which is quite nice. So in conclusion, deep learning is quite a powerful and popular tool nowadays, and many various fields benefit from methods that are based on deep learning. So we only scratched the surface on this project, but we did show that there are opportunities for deep learning-based methods in instrumented infrastructure, and that we are able to process quite complex data with the deep learning-based methods here. So yeah, I guess that would be it from me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Okay.